Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on the subject of pupil attendance. My name's Sam Tranter. I'm a Senior Advice Officer at NGA. I'll just start briefly with a bit of housekeeping. Today's webinar will be split between my colleague Fiona and I. I'm going to hand over to her about halfway through. There's an overview of what we're going to discuss here today. So I'm going to begin by going over the DfE's vision and strategy in relation to pupil attendance. We're going to take a look at Ofsted research and analysis and some general points on the governing board's role in relation to attendance, including the principles of an effective attendance strategy from a governing board perspective. I'm then going to hand over to Fiona, and she's going to take us through some of the reasons and types of non-attendance and the risks associated with them. She's going to unpack non-attendance a bit more and talk about getting the response right. And then we'll end on a bit of a summary as to some questions that you can take away and ask on the subject of attendance. Quick note on the fact that this is being recorded and it will be available on demand on the NGA website once we're finished. And you can also find links to the guidance documents that I'll mention in the form of DfE attendance guidance and the Ofsted research report on NGA's attendance page. So all those links are together in one place. Just type the word attendance into our knowledge centre and you'll find them there to follow up for further reading purposes. So why attendance today? Yes, it is a major priority for the department and for Ofsted at the moment. There's a couple of more basic and very important reasons. If children aren't in school, they're probably not learning, and there are potential safeguarding concerns there. We also know better than ever, thanks to the pandemic, the importance of routine and structure to learning. And then there's the fact that some pupils have simply not come back after the lockdowns, and that's not just because of having to isolate due to COVID-19. So this is a really important issue to be getting stuck into at the moment. Here is the national attendance figure that was released on the 19th of April, but it actually relates to data from the 7th, so before Easter. That figure for the proportion of open settings is rounded up, but only slightly. 99.9% of settings were open on the 7th of April, but only 89.1% of pupils were attending the sessions that they were expected to. Also, here is the national persistent absence figure for the year 2021 to 22 so far, 12.1%, and that is up from 10.8% the last time this figure was recorded uninterrupted by the pandemic in the year 2018-19. So little wonder the department it has this priority of driving attendance figures back to and beyond pre-pandemic levels. The department's being very clear that children will not achieve their potential in school with poor standards of attendance. I think we can all agree that. Therefore, the department recently consulted on changes aimed at improving the quality and consistency of support around attendance. In a nutshell, this focused on setting clear expectations about the roles of schools and trusts, as well as local authorities. And the consultation, the proposals, they outline changes to the attendance legal framework, including a proposal to formalise the requirement for all schools to have an attendance policy and to have regard to new statutory guidance on attendance management and improvement. There's also plans for a clearer, more consistent national framework for the use of attendance legal intervention, including a new regulatory framework for issuing fixed penalty notices for absence, and a plan to bring in rules for granting leaves of absence in academies in line with other state-funded schools. So I think it's important that we look at what minimum attendance management expectations might be on the horizon for the next academic year. And we've got on this slide here, the governing board responsibilities in relation to attendance that are likely to feature in new statutory guidance. Those will be to promote good attendance and help schools focus their improvement efforts, ensuring attendance is covered in improvement strategies. ensuring that training is provided to school staff, so making this part of the wider CPD offer, a statutory requirement to hold school leaders to account and provide support and challenge on their attendance management and improvement, and in multi-academy trusts, as well as trust-wide oversight of attendance, ensuring the sharing of good practice across schools within the trust. Following the consultation in February, we had the school's white paper in March. The intention to create new statutory guidance and the attendance policy mandatory requirement that was reiterated, as well as additional support that was outlined. It's probably worth bearing in mind what those additional support measures were. They are plans to make it easier for schools to access and emulate best practice around attendance, off-the-shelf attendance interventions and new voluntary standards for attendance professionals in schools and trusts, and national data requirements and new rules on recording attendance that are designed to make it easier to identify and understand attendance patterns. Then we should also be paying attention to a recent Ofsted research report. It was called Securing Good Attendance and Tackling Persistent Absence. This research resulted from a briefing requested by the Secretary of State in line with the department's intent to prioritise good practice in promoting attendance and tackling absence. So basically, it's on Ofsted's radar because it's on the government's radar, and that's why we need to be talking about it today. One of the sources for the research behind this report was a survey of inspectors in the autumn term last year. And that survey found that those responsible for governance were not consistently setting a clear direction for leaders on promoting attendance and challenging absence. In fact, only around a quarter of inspectors identified that in most or all of their inspections, those responsible for governance had done this. Now, this matters because we also got in the school's white paper a commitment from Ofsted to inspect all schools against the current inspection framework by the end of the summer term 2025. So with that inspection target in mind, let's have a look at what the law currently says. Now, this is taken from the school attendance guidance for schools, and there are basic expectations for schools, local authorities, parents and pupils outlined in there. For schools and local authorities, it's an expectation to promote good attendance and reduce absence, including persistent absence being defined as missing 10% or more of the sessions available to any one pupil. Ensure every pupil has access to full-time education to which they're entitled, and acting early to address patterns of absence. Parents are expected to perform their legal duty by ensuring their children of compulsory school age who are registered attend regularly, and the pupils are expected to be punctual to their lessons. So we mustn't overlook that punctuality forms part of this conversation about attendance. We also have a summary in the governance handbook, which sets out minimum requirements for governing boards in relation to pupil attendance. It's a simple one. It's these two short paragraphs here. It's about reassuring themselves that the school keeps admission and attendance registers, taking note of the guidance on school attendance, and making sure that the relevant information requested by the Secretary of State is provided. And then also being aware of the guidance in keeping children safe in education, the statutory guidance on safeguarding about children missing education. Now, those are very basic minimum requirements we currently have. So currently we need to look elsewhere for guidance on effectively challenging and holding school leaders to account for rates of attendance. And it makes sense to begin with what Ofsted have said most recently on this. I'm going back here to the contents of the research report that I previously mentioned. The main point Ofsted made in relation to the governing board role is don't limit your discussion to overall attendance figures, because these don't reveal what lies beneath, what the patterns are, or whether there are issues with particular groups of pupil. Basically, the main problem identified by Ofsted was the fact that it's simply not enough to have a look at what the school's overall attendance figure is and to compare it to the national average. Got to dig deeper than that, ask for more data, scrutinise what it means for particular groups, and go from there and ask your questions about that. The other main point that Ofsted made was that boards need to consider whether there's a culture of what they called low expectations around attendance and how that might be overturned. In Ofsted's words, this is about changing mindsets, it's about raising expectations, and it's about providing more challenge. Since the publication of that report, Ofsted actually did a webinar for the DfE on the subject of attendance, where they were asked directly, how can governing boards effectively challenge and hold leaders to account for rates of attendance? The answer was to demand a realistic and detailed picture of attendance, so more than just the big picture, more than just the overall attendance figure. Then ask questions. What does that mean for different groups of pupils? How does it compare with how does that figure compare with where you would expect it to be given the circumstances? Are there any barriers to improving attendance for particular groups and even individuals? And in multi-academy trusts, how does the attendance figure compare between schools within the trust, and how does that compare to what the local context is for those individual schools? So in short, it's about getting enough data, asking enough questions, and then supporting leaders to challenge parents and pupils to get on board with this. What we have here is a simple list of effective practices for securing good attendance and tackling absence identified by Ofsted in the research report. I'm not going to go into these in any great depth because Fiona will do that. Fiona's going to paint a bigger picture when it comes to some of these things. And it is worth noting that these relate to a lot of operational practices, but this is about having these things on your radar in order to ask the right questions about what's taking place. So these practices include effective communication with parents and pupils. It's about finding out what the problems are, having the right people in place, noticing patterns, asking questions about how the attendance strategy is ambitious, getting beneath the surface, so beneath that overall attendance figure, and working with individuals. Like I said, we'll return to several of those practices when Fiona gets into more detail on those. On the flip side, here are the weaknesses identified by Ofsted. It's a lack of strategic oversight, it's a lack of data analysis and targeted questioning, and a lack of urgency, defined as waiting too long to challenge. Here we have some information from the DfE's latest guidance on improving attendance, namely the principles of an effective whole school attendance strategy and what this means for the governing board role. So this is about making attendance an explicit priority, beginning with an attendance strategy that's developed and maintained on a whole school or trust basis. The first key area for this is leadership and management. And what I'm doing here, by the way, is I'm taking a few points from each of the key areas that are identified in the DfE guidance on an effective whole school attendance strategy. And you can go and find much more detail in the guidance document. But what I've done is pluck from that what these things mean from a governing board perspective. So in relation to leadership and management, it means having a clear vision for attendance, including recognition that this is an important area of school improvement. So it may well be added to the school improvement or development plan, whatever it's called in your context. It means having an accurate view of attendance. So again, enough data. It's about empowering leaders and staff to take responsibility for attendance and ensuring that this priority is resourced appropriately. Moving on, another key principle is relationships and communication. And here, this is about ensuring that there's a positive and a welcoming culture built on engagement with parents, pupils, staff, and other stakeholders. And that includes local authorities and sharing enough data with them. And that applies to multi-academy trusts as well. On systems and data, this is about ensuring that data is collected at cohort, group, and individual level in order to spot patterns, particularly amongst vulnerable groups. So when we're talking about groups, particularly the vulnerable ones, we're talking about pupil premium children, those for whom English is an additional language, SEND pupils, Even the difference between boys and girls, these are the kind of groups that we want to see attendance data broken down into, to spot those patterns, to see where the issues are, to ask targeted questions about targeted support and intervention in those areas. It's also about having attendance, safeguarding and pastoral policies that clearly outline key principles, rules and consequence systems. And finally, on intervention, ensure intervention is delivered in a targeted, there's that word again, targeted and timely fashion, and monitor the impact of interventions. So just a final couple of points from me on the governing board's role. Securing attendance is very much an ongoing process, so make it a regular agenda item because it deserves to be. This means making regular use of attendance and absence data, which the leadership team should analyse and present in the way that we've touched on already. So yes, an overall figure, but we're looking at cohorts, vulnerable groups, and also ask how does attendance data compare for the last with previous years. That's another way of spotting patterns and talking about what the issues may be. And then ask questions. Again, what do you know about barriers to attendance? What's being done to overcome them? And what impact are actions and interventions having? In other words, make sure something is being done to address barriers to attendance, rather than allowing them simply to be used as an excuse for why attendance is poor. Finally, acknowledge that securing good attendance is a question of culture, and ask what evidence is there that good attendance, as a consistently high priority, is promoted on a whole school or trust basis. So how does that engage pupils, staff, parents, outside agencies, and what is the evidence of how this is taking place? And a final note that's come out from the DFE and Ofsted's research is that this includes maintaining a strong behaviour culture on the basis of key principles, inclusion, support, tolerance, which research has shown that it can have a positive impact on attendance as well as attainment. So I'm gonna pause at this point and hand over to Fiona, because that's the end of my whistle-stop tour on the importance of having an effective attendance strategy and what that might look like in practice for boards based on what's been said by the department and Ofsted recently. But I'm going to hand over to Fiona to talk you through some of those other reasons behind absence, to dig a little bit deeper and think about why you're asking the questions you should be.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks so much. Just to answer a couple of questions regarding the slides, you will get the slides at the end of the session. We'll email those out to you, so don't worry too much about that. Some of you have raised a couple of points throughout Sam's section, so I'm going to try and answer some of those questions best I can. Some of them are quite contextual questions that will be very that will be unique to your school and or trust. So it's really taking what we're saying as broader principles and applying them to your context, and really knowing your local context and knowing your school. One of the things that I always say is that national data is hugely important. Local data is even more important, but the data that you have on your school, on your pupils, is the most important data that you hold. So really kind of taking what we're saying, I guess, and then applying it to your own context will be really important. Okay then, Sam, do you want to move me on to my first slide? Okay, so just starting off with a quote from Rachel de Souza. So she's our schools commissioner. And she recently published a report which were the interim findings on the issue of school non-attendance, school absence effectively. And really looking at where there is a huge issue around attendance. And I think Sue mentioned in the comments earlier on that actually some of the data that Ofsted used in their report, their research report, that was published earlier this year, was taken from a time when, and well, it still is the case, but a time when there were a lot of absences in relation to COVID. So perhaps it's not the most accurate, fair picture of attendance. And Sue, you're absolutely right. But I guess looking at what attendance looks like now, real time as well, despite the fact that COVID is a factor in that, is really important. And without trying to divert too much, this week the Education Select Committee questioned Nadeem Zahawi on the whole thing of school attendance data, and it's not fair. And you know, and our schools going to start to feel like they're having to pitch against one another, and one school's better than another. And he kind of said we need to get away from that, looking at data where it's a case of it's not fair because it's been COVID, or it's not fair because one school's been affected. We really just need to look at that data, understand it for our own context, and start to address it that way. But one of the most important roles that a governor or a trustee has, those on the governing board, is to ensure that the school is creating a safe environment for the children that they're serving. And that means protecting pupils from maltreatment, preventing impairment of pupils' mental and physical health or development, ensuring that pupils grow up in circumstances consistent with provision and safe, effective care, and taking action to ensure all pupils have the best outcomes. And Rachel de Souza's quote here from this interim report on her interim findings, on the state of school attendance at present. She says it is right to reassert the need for urgency in efforts to keep all children safe in the context of COVID. And we know that attendance was an issue before COVID. We know that there were pupil mental health and well-being was an issue before COVID. We know that there were a lot of issues before COVID that were exacerbated by the pandemic. And so what the pandemic's done is it's really shone a light on already existing issues. And one of the things that she says is that understanding persistent school absence is part of that. Okay, next slide, please, Sam. So Sam's already mentioned a little bit about persistent absence and severe absence. So again, kind of adding to Sue's point, it would be really unfair to say that this is an accurate picture outside of COVID. And also the interim report that the Schools Commissioner published, the data isn't the best. It's a little bit flaky because they didn't get responses from all local authorities across the whole country, and that's the aim. The aim is to get as much accurate data as possible. But the data that they did get said that the average rate of estimated persistent absence, which is missing over 10% of sessions, was 22%, and the average rate of severe absence, which is missing over 50% of sessions, was 1.5%. And there are the figures there. So just to clarify, a session is an AM mark, and a PM mark is another session. So there's 2 sessions in the school day. Next slide, please, Sam. So, I mean, we'll have a little look at this in a little bit more detail as we go along, but there's lots of different reasons for school absence. And as I'm kind of just talking and going into this second part of the webinar, just have a little think about and of course, whether you do know what are the main reasons for school absence at your school. It may well be that you're not aware, and perhaps that's something that you want to start thinking about. And of course, the purpose of this part of the webinar is really to kind of paint a picture of what things look like on the ground. I spent 16 years in education, and most recently as Director of Safeguarding for Sandwell Pupil Referral Units, and I have a really good idea of what things look like on the ground in relation to school attendance and safeguarding and the link between those. And so I'm trying to kind of paint a picture and that you can kind of maybe frame some questions around when it does come to speaking to your school leaders at board meetings. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so One of the things that Sam mentioned is that there's not a whole lot of guidance out there for governors and trustees and those on board specific to attendance and your responsibilities around attendance. But what we can do is we can think about some of the risks that are posed by school absence. So, for example, underachieving, and then some form of harm, exploitation, radicalisation, and so on and so forth. The list is right there. And the link to some of the areas of oversight that you may have. So whilst there may not be a whole heap out there on attendance, you do have responsibility and oversight for other areas which are very much linked to non-school attendance. So that's worth thinking about. Next slide, please, Sam. So just thinking about types of school absence. So truancy tends, no, just before I start, actually, just a little bit of a disclaimer. None of these forms of attendance are linked to a register code. So there's not a register code for truancy or school withdrawal, etc. They're all unauthorised absences, but it's really helpful to understand perhaps the context around the absence and why a child may be absent from school in order to deal with it. So truancy tends to be more where the parent isn't aware and the school isn't aware, and tends to be less to do with kind of any significant emotional issues around school attendance, and more just to kind of, as we would have called it when we were kids, to wag a day, and perhaps go out and get up to no good maybe, or just chill out at friends or what have you. Then you've got school withdrawal. So this is more linked to where parents may withdraw their child from school because of a perceived risk, perhaps, or because they're not happy about something that's happened at school, or it could also be to do with, it could also be linked to safeguarding issues at home, perhaps to conceal some form of abuse or maltreatment. School refusal. So this tends to be more around where a child refuses to go to school, specifically because they don't want to go to school. School causes them some form of significant anxiety, and they don't like school. And it's deeper than just not liking school, but school is the issue for them. And then just move my little box over here. Emotionally based school avoidance. It's not a medical condition, but this tends to be where a child's different to school refusal, because they're not refusing to go to school, but there's an issue at school that they're trying to avoid. And so we'll have a little look at those in a little bit more detail on the next few slides, but that's more to do with, it could potentially be bullying. So they do want to attend school and perhaps do want to engage in their education, but they're unable to do so because there's some form of perceived risk going on. If you could just move on to the next slide, please. Sam, just checking the time. I'm going to try and be really quick now and whiz through this. I'm very aware of time. Don't want to take up your afternoon. So it's really important to understand why, looking at risk factors. So school ethos and environment, again, that's something as governors and trustees that you will be thinking about. And I'm not going to go through the whole list because we could be here for a little while, but this is more about a young person perhaps experiencing bullying, a lack of involvement in extracurricular activities, perhaps a sense of belonging within the school setting. And I do want to mention here, it does come up quite a bit, but the data shows that school absence does tend to be a bigger issue amongst disadvantaged children, and there'll be all sorts of reasons for that. But one of the things that we do talk about, we have talked about quite a bit at NGA, and working with the Child Poverty Action Group and thinking about some of the work that they do, it's really important to think about the school curriculum and the school day and the cost of the school day. And sometimes we can unwittingly, as educators, exclude those who are disadvantaged, socioeconomically disadvantaged, and because of the cost of going to school, whether that's to do with uniform, PE kit, school apparatus, the cost of going on trips, etc. And when a child doesn't feel like they belong, even if there's an offer of paying for it. When that's really highlighted and the child doesn't feel like they belong, they're less likely to attend. And so quite often that can be a reason for non-attendance too. So it's worth really thinking about that. There's a really good resource from Child Poverty Action Group called The Cost of the School Day calendar, and lots of resources on poverty proofing your school. Okay, next slide, please. I'm going to whiz through these now. So again, curriculum, teaching and learning. So it's really thinking about your curriculum offer. Is it engaging? Is it something that inspires your pupils? Do they have aspirations, for their future? And does your curriculum take them to that place? Next slide, please. Parent carer attitudes. I mean, one of the things that we know that the DFE present governors and trustees with 3 core functions, and we've kind of added our own onto that as the 4th core function, which is parental engagement, or stakeholder engagement even, sorry. So and engaging with parents is really important with that. And so thinking about where the disengagement from a parent may sit and how your school can engage with parents and how that's happening. Next slide, please. And then, of course, family and community. So those of you who understand or have a safeguarding background will understand the term contextual safeguarding. So really thinking about what are the risks, what are the safeguarding risks posed to a child when they step outside of their front door, and so some areas it may be that it's sexual exploitation or criminal exploitation, others it may be antisocial behaviour. There's various types of contextual safeguarding, and so it's really worth, as I said at the beginning, understanding that local context, understanding what's going on, and I think Sam's already touched on it, with other schools, communicating with other schools, communicating with other local agencies, and really working collaboratively with the local authority, police, youth offending service, and other community groups, to really get an idea of how you can best tackle that. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, they're just a few of the barriers that some of the children shared with when the Children's Commissioner did her report. I'm not going to labour too much on that. If we could go to the next slide. Brilliant. Okay, so Sam mentioned that lateness, it's really worth thinking about lateness when it comes to school attendance, because if a child is late, they'll get that L mark, so they'll still be registered, they'll still get their attendance mark, but they were late. If a child is late after the register has closed, so they still attend in the morning, but they're late after the register is closed, they'll get a U mark, and that means it's an unauthorised absence for a significant part of that morning, which means even though they're in school, they will be marked as absent, or they'll lose that sessions mark. So if there's a child that's absent every single day in a week, after the register's closed, their attendance for that week would be 50%. So just thinking back to when I worked at the pupil referral unit, and I have shared this story before in one of my articles in GM, but it's kind of a really classic example, really. There was a young lady, and she would come in after the register had closed. It was usually 45 minutes late on the dot every day, and every day staff would say, "Why are you late? What's going on?" And kind of chastise her for being late, really. Extremely long story short, and after a lot of time really trying to build a relationship with this young lady who was extremely defiant. This was in a pupil referral unit, and she'd been excluded for defiance, consistent defiance. We eventually got to the bottom of her lateness, and what would happen is she'd drop her younger sister to primary school each morning and then rush to get to school herself as early as she possibly can, which was always 45 minutes late. And so when we dug a little bit deeper, it turned out that mom was an alcoholic, and she would wake up in the morning and sort her mom out with her measures of vodka for that day that she'd have to have in order to stay alive, really, because that was the point at which she'd got to in her alcoholism. And she would then she'd sort her sister out, her little sister out for school, and she was effectively acting as, I think I saw a comment about young carers there, and I didn't get to read it, but she was effectively a young carer for both her younger sister and her mother. And so once we'd questioned and got a real kind of perspective on what the issue was, we were able to kind of meet her where she was and put the support mechanisms in place, which of course meant some referrals, but then really taking a lead on that as well. Her attendance is so important, and she shouldn't be carrying that burden. And so putting those things in place to ensure that she wasn't. And when you're addressing non-attendance, it's so important to yes, meet that child where they are, meet the family where they are, but also really make sure that you are leading and you're not led by them. They may be having a really challenging time, and it may be a really challenging situation. Somebody asked a question about what do you do about those who have real anxiety about returning back to school, and that's a really tough one. And it's really, really important that your school staff have the relationship with that family, but also with other organisations, whether that's a local authority, other organisations who can put some support in place and put in place that kind of targeted support. But it's important that you lead that process and you provide the solutions and the interventions to address that poor attendance. Now, not everybody's story, not every child's story is going to be like that young lady's, but you know that the principles are the same, and it's really thinking about that when you're talking to your school leaders. What processes do they have in place for addressing non-attendance? Next slide, please. Again, so really thinking about your response, you know that you're going to need that universal approach to ensuring, and I've used this image in webinars before, and I know that Sam Henson uses it, and we really like this because it's really thinking about what kind of fire am I putting out here? One size does not always fit all. What are we addressing? We can put those kind of cultural school ethos systems in place that really kind of create a culture of attending school and good attendance. But then there are children who are going to need those targeted interventions. Like the young lady that I was talking about, and actually she also needs some specialist support as well. And in answer to the question again that somebody asked about the anxiety specific absence, there should be support within your local authority for those issues. And it's also really worth talking to other schools. Have you talked to other schools in your local area about the kind of interventions that they're putting in place, and is there some good practice that they could share as well? So it's really thinking about your response. And next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to finish on this slide. There's another slide after this one, and it is about questions that you can ask your school leaders. But this was a quote from that interim report. There are no hard to reach children, only hard to reach services. And I think that's something that we really need to question. How are we reaching out to those children and those families? And are we connecting with them enough? Now, I share all of this, not to say as governors and trustees, these are the things that you should be doing, but I share all of this to say this is a little bit of a context on what happens on the ground and what can happen on the ground, and really to think about some of those things. And I know it's just a whistle-stop tour, and it's very quick, but just having a real think about when you are sitting around in your board meetings, and you're talking to your school leaders about how attendance is being addressed, really kind of maybe framing your questions around some of this information. There may be information that I've shared that you think, actually, I wonder whether our school leaders are doing that, or I wonder whether our school has thought about that, or the kind of interventions. And you can put the next slide on, actually, Sam. And these are a few of the questions that you might want to ask that would then unpick and uncover some of the information that I've shared today. And that's it, really. I mean, again, it's really quick, and I'm sorry that we've gone over, and sorry we haven't got more time. I'm sure you're not sorry that we haven't got more time. So it may be time for me to shut up, but But yeah, so what we will do is, if you do have questions, of course, we will save the chat and we'll have a look at some of the questions that you've asked in the chat. And also there'll be a link that goes out with the slides and also an opportunity to feedback. And you can ask questions in there as well, and we'll try to get back to you and give you and kind of answer some of those in the best way we can. And that's it. So thank you so much for joining us today. We do have some upcoming events as well on the next slide, almost forgot. So if you do want to attend any of the upcoming events, if you go to our NGA website and click on events, you'll be able to book onto any of those there. It's following the links. Thank you so much for joining us on a lovely sunny afternoon. I'm sure there's lots of other stuff that you could have been doing this afternoon, so thank you for coming and listening, and we'll see you soon at future events.